Okay, my name is Deahn Berrini, and my book is Milkweed, which is a novel set in the early 1970s, and it tells the story of a Vietnam veteran's return from the Vietnam War, but the story is told from the point of view of the family and particularly the girlfriend he left behind.
And what inspired you to write this book?
A number of things inspired me, but I think the first inspiration came from a class I took way back in college. When I was at Brown University, I took a class in the Vietnam War, and as part of my junior thesis, I spent a number of hours in a veterans center, and this was in the 80s before any issues of returning veterans from Vietnam were well known or national news, and I learned a lot by talking to the veterans there, and I got the sense from their stories that we hadn't really done right by them, and they had gone through experiences which we hadn't acknowledged, and they had illnesses that we weren't doing enough to cure. And then but I knew I couldn't write a story from a veteran's point of view, from a combat point of view, because that's not who I am. So I sat with that for a number of years until I ran into a woman who had lost her husband. He was a pilot, and he was shot down over Laos, and he was missing in action, and they had never found his body, and they had to declare him dead after 5 years. And it was a really tragic story, and what struck me talking with her is that when I met her, it had been a number of years, but she never really got over it, and I realized that's something you don't get over. And then I went home, and literally the next day I realized that I had my story. It was sort of the veterans I had met through her mouth, and the next day I sat down and I had my character, I had my setting, and I just sort of went with that. It's hard to even imagine, but first of all, when the veterans came home from Vietnam, they weren't even welcomed. They were spat on, thrown things at, and called baby killers, and so they had that. So if you were a veteran, you couldn't really talk to anyone about it. And then there were a number of symptoms that they were having, which are actually universal in returning veterans, who were unidentified, and they were just labeled as crazy, or well, that's what they got. They got what they deserved because they were over there. It's a very ugly situation, and until the set of symptoms were labeled, which took place in the late 70s. And then I think the Vietnam War Memorial did a lot to focus our attention on the veterans, and since that time we've learned a ton. But I think at the same time I just had a conversation with a friend who's a doctor in the military, and he was telling me about all the study they had done from returning veterans in the first Gulf War and how they had experienced so many symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they were all ready for the next war, and they would be ready for the next group of veterans. And he said that the sad thing is they still weren't ready. They didn't know it was going to hit them, and it's almost as if with each new conflict we have to learn it over and over again. But I think I veered a little off track, but basically yes, we've come a long way. So you're not shamed, you're encouraged to get help, and that's a huge difference.
Now, this was your first book. Are you working on another book?
I have another one ready to go. We wanted to work on publicizing this one and get this one out before we put the other one to press. So it may be a year or more before the next one comes out. That's called How to Earn Your Keep. It's about a brother and a sister who run into financial trouble. And then I'm always working on something. So I have another thing I'm cooking up now, but I don't want to talk too much about that because it's in the halfway through, and that's a dangerous spot for a book because it could fail or it could keep on going. You don't really know yet. So.
And also, as a first-time novelist, are there things that you would have done differently now looking back, and what advice do you have for other aspiring writers?
You know, I think a lot of it is just keeping your focus, keep on writing, get help from other people, let other people read your writing, make sure you're not on the wrong path, make sure what you've written is good enough, because a lot of people love to write, and I teach writing, so I think it's an amazing thing that people are writing, but you have to be willing to edit, you have to be willing to show it to other people, you have to be willing to write it 80,000 times and not one time. I think the one thing I might have done is when I was a lot younger, I might have tried to get into a creative writing program because you make a lot of connections there, and I didn't do that. But other than that, it's an individual road, and we all have our own path. And I don't look back. I really wouldn't change anything. I'm really happy to be where I am with the book, with my publisher. Small as it is, small but mine, right?